Lynching in the United States was the widespread occurrence of extrajudicial killings, which began in the pre-Civil War South in the 1830s and ended during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 1960s. Collective violence was a familiar aspect of the early American legal landscape, with group violence in colonial America being usually non-lethal in intention and result. In the 17th century, in the context of unsettled social and political conditions in the American colonies, lynchings became a frequent form of mob justice, when the authorities were perceived as untrustworthy. Most of the lynchings occurred in the American South because the majority of African Americans lived there, but racially motivated lynchings also occurred in the Midwest and border states. One of the earliest recorded victims of lynchings happened in Alabama, 1889, to George Meadows. A white woman reported that she had been raped and her son killed by an African American man. Over 400 white coal miners formed themselves into groups and brought several black men to the woman, who was unable to identify any of them as the alleged criminal. The next day, the miners brought Meadows, a new arrival, to the area, and after a brief investigation, determined him to be guilty. The woman begged the mob not to lynch Meadows, as she was unsure if he was the criminal, but the mob went forward with the lynching and killed him near the coal mines. Following his death, his body was shot multiple times and left in public view by an undertaker as a warning to others. A major motive for lynchings, particularly in the South, was the white society's efforts to maintain white supremacy after the emancipation of the enslaved people following the American Civil War. It punished perceived violations of customs, later institutionalized as Jim Crow laws, which mandated racial segregation of whites and blacks and second-class status for blacks. Although the victims of lynchings were members of various ethnicities, after roughly 4 million enslaved African Americans were emancipated, they became the primary targets of white Southerners. Native Americans and Mexican Americans were also the targets of lynching as well. A significant number of lynching victims were accused of murder or attempted murder, which were often used as pretexts for lynching African Americans. Their reasoning was that the African Americans were violating Jim Crow-era etiquette, or engaged in economic competition with whites. One study found that there were 4,467 total victims of lynching from 1883 to 1941. 3,265 were black, 1,082 were white, 71 were Mexican or of Mexican descent, 38 were American Indian, 10 were Chinese, and 1 was Japanese. Tuskegee Institute's method of categorizing most lynching victims as either black or white in publications and data summaries meant that the murders of some minority and immigrant groups were obscured. In the West, for instance, Mexican, Native Americans, and Chinese were more frequent targets of lynchings than were African Americans, but their deaths were included among those of other whites. Similarly, although Italian immigrants were the focus of violence in Louisiana, when they started arriving in greater numbers, their deaths were not tabulated separately from whites. Leo Max Frank was a Jewish victim of lynching on August 1915, in Atlanta, Georgia. He was falsely accused with the strangulation, rape, and death of Mary Fagan, who worked in the same building. Due to conflicting testimonies and inadequate evidence, his sentence was reduced from the death penalty to life imprisonment. The public was outraged. In a coordinated event with dozens of men, they broke into prison, seized Frank, and then drained the gas from the prison's automobiles and handcuffed the warden, so they wouldn't get followed. They drove Leo near the home of his alleged victim, Mary Fagan, where he was hung, and made sure his corpse was facing the house where Mary lived. A common perception of lynchings in the U.S. is that they were only hangings, due to their public visibility, which made it easier for photographers to photograph the victims. Some lynchings were professionally photographed, and then the photos were distributed as postcards, which became popular souvenirs in parts of the United States. Lynching victims were also killed in a variety of other ways, being shot, burned alive, thrown off a bridge, dragged behind a car, etc. Jesse Washington was a 17-year-old African-American farmhand who was lynched in Waco, Texas, on May 1916. He was chained by his neck and dragged out of the county court by observers. He was then paraded through the street, all while being stabbed and beaten, before being held down and castrated. He was then lynched in front of Waco's City Hall. Lynchings were not always fatal. Mock lynchings, which involved putting a rope around the neck of someone who was suspected of concealing information, was sometimes used to compel people to make confessions. Whites used these events to demonstrate their power and control in front of their community, including children. This often led to the exodus of the remaining black population and discouraged future settlement. After the American Civil War, Southern whites struggled to maintain their dominance. The lynchers sometimes murdered their victims, but sometimes whipped or physically assaulted them to remind them of their former status as slaves. Often nighttime raids of African American homes were made in order to confiscate firearms. Secret vigilante and terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, instigated extrajudicial assaults and killings in order to discourage freed Africans from voting, working, and getting educated. D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, glorified the original Ku Klux Klan as protecting white Southern women during Reconstruction, which he portrayed as a time of violence and corruption. Emmett Lewis Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy who was abducted, tortured, and lynched in Mississippi in 1955. As he was from the North, from Chicago, he was unaware of the sensitivities in Mississippi, where the Ku Klux Klan and night riders were part of daily lives. Till was accused of offending a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, by whistling at her. In actuality, he had a slight speech problem, and he sometimes whistled to alleviate his stuttering. In the early morning hours of August 28, 1955, Carolyn's husband and half-brother absconded with Till in their pickup truck. Arriving at a secluded barn, he was beaten and then drowned. When he was found, his face was unrecognizable due to trauma and having been submerged in water. Till's body was returned to Chicago, where his mother insisted on a public funeral service with an open casket to focus attention not only on U.S. racism and the barbarism of lynching, but also the limitations and vulnerabilities of American democracy. Lynch mobs varied in size from just a few people to crowds of thousands. It was often treated as a spectacle sport, where large crowds gathered to partake in or watch the torture and mutilation of the victims. Occasionally, the body parts of the victims were removed and sold as souvenirs. The attendants often treated these as festive events, with food and family photos. After a lynching, photographers would sell their pictures as is, or as postcards, sometimes costing as much as 50 cents apiece, or $9 as of 2016. When viewed from an outsider's perspective, bereft of local context, the postcards symbolized white power more generally. White citizens were depicted as victorious over powerless murdered black victims, and the pictures became part of secular iconography. African Americans resisted lynchings in numerous ways. Intellectuals and journalists encouraged public education, actively protesting and lobbying against lynch mob violence and government complicity. In 1930, Southern white women responded in large numbers to the leadership of Jessie Daniel Ames, in forming the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. She and her co-founders obtained the signatures of 40,000 women to their pledge against lynching and for a change in the South. Despite hostile opposition and physical threats, including rape and murder, the women leaders persisted with petition drives, letter campaigns, meetings, and demonstrations to highlight the issues. By the 1930s, the number of lynchings had dropped to about 10 per year in Southern states. Although lynchings have become rare following the civil rights movement and the resulting changes in American social norms, some lynchings have still occurred. In 1981, two KKK members in Alabama randomly selected a 19-year-old black man, Michael Donald, beat and strangled him to death, simply as a retaliation for a jury's recent acquittal of a black man who was accused of murdering a white police officer. The Klansmen were caught, prosecuted, and convicted, and one was sentenced to death. A $7 million judgment in a civil suit against the Klan bankrupted the United Klans of America, a local Klan subgroup. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, known as NAACP, as well as related groups, organized support from white and black Americans, publicizing injustices, investigating incidents, and working for passage of federal anti-lynching legislation. After several decades, this finally passed on March 29, 2022, and aptly called the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act.